This is the world's most upgraded Losi Promoto, and today, we're gonna build it from scratch. We've got every single upgrade you can get for this bike, and I'm really excited to see how this thing turns out. Let's get started. This is gonna be my first Promoto build, and this thing's pretty different from an RC car. We're gonna be starting with the chassis and working our way from there. Along the way, we're gonna have some pretty interesting things to talk about because there's some technology in this bike that you may never have seen before. First step's gonna be the main drive motor. We're gonna be keeping most of the stock electronics in here just to make sure this thing actually works properly when it's done. That being said, other than the electronics, pretty much everything is going to be upgraded on this bike. As the name suggests, this uses gyroscopic force in order to help keep the bike upright. This is a huge, heavy steel weight. And using the integral ESC, it's spun at high speeds by this little motor here. And this works because the weight of the gyroscope has something known as angular momentum. Basically, this weight does not want to spin. It all wants to go outward. And that outward energy means it resists you trying to rotate it while it's spinning. And all of this means because this giant weight is spinning inside the motorcycle, when the motorcycle tries to lean over, the weight resists that leaning. This is the same gyroscopic force that actually keeps all motorcycles and bicycles upright. However, as you reduce the size of something, its mass disproportionately gets smaller. So in the case of an RC motorcycle, we need additional gyroscopic force in order to keep it stable. This is especially true on an RC motorcycle because you're not on it, so you can't help balance it. Now, speaking of weight and balance, I'm really curious to see how adding all this weight is going to affect how this motorcycle rides. We're definitely going to be finding that out. That is, of course, assuming I actually got all the parts I need and I get this thing put together right the first time, which is certainly not a foregone conclusion since I've never done this before. And I've already made a mistake, as will probably be a running theme in this. We've got a screw underneath this motor that needs to go in first. I think we're going to be pretty intimately knowledgeable about this bike by the time we're done with this build. Looking at the breakdown, this is just a support for various parts, but it does go under both motors. And next we've got the ESC, as well as the front brake servo. This chassis part is the most complicated section of the bike to put together, and you've got to pay attention to things like the power button for the ESC going through the bracket for the front brake mount. Fortunately, once we make our way through this mess of proprietary ESC wiring, we've got some really cool stuff coming, including carbon fiber wheels. One of the things we definitely don't normally see on RC cars is electronic noise mitigation that we see on this. We've got a grounding strap here, as well as a big ferrite bead here. I'm guessing that's all in response to this gyroscope. This thing's got a lot of energy in it, and it probably does create a fair amount of electronic noise. There are definitely a lot of custom parts on here. One of them is this clamshell for the power lead. As I'm putting this together, I can definitely see where the money for this goes. Okay, I think we're ready to put this other side plate on. As we do, all these wires have to go through here, and we should be able to screw this together. I think there's about a 25% chance this is the only time I have to put this side plate on. Write your guesses down in the comments, and we'll see who's right. For now, though, I'm glad to be getting this together because this was the part of the build that was definitely making me the most nervous. Okay, I'm pretty sure that's fully together. Let's move on to something a bit more fun, and that's these beautiful carbon fiber and aluminum trail wheels. They're missing most of their screws. I'm gonna go ahead and get these put in. I won't make you sit through that. All right, well, that's 45 minutes of my life I'll never get back, but they certainly do look good. Next thing you do is install the tires. If you've never installed tires, it's pretty straightforward. The first thing I wanna recommend you do is get some rubbing alcohol and put it on a paper towel, and just give all the surfaces that are actually gonna get glued a quick wipe down. You never know what's on these surfaces, and if there's oil on here or anything like that, it could cause problems. As you can see, there's a little bit of black getting on the paper towel. I recommend against using a rag because a lot of detergents and especially dryer sheets have oils and wax in them, and those oils and waxes will get dissolved by the alcohol, and then you'll just be putting them on the surfaces you're getting ready to glue. Now, once you've got everything clean, I definitely recommend some gloves because you're going to be working with super glue, and super glue usually will get on your fingers. To do this installation, make sure your foam is centered up in your tire, and we're just going to stretch the tire over the wheel, trying not to rip that foam. This can be a little bit challenging depending on what tire and wheel combination you're working with, but usually it's pretty straightforward if you take your time. Then once we get that over, we can pull this side onto the lip. And then you just kind of want to check around and make sure everything's positioned where you want it. You can see this isn't quite centered on there. So we just work our way around, make sure everything looks good. We've got something that looks a little odd right here, so we can just reposition that. This side needs to be pushed on the rim as well. Various wheels and tires will install differently, but the basics are always the same. The next step's going to depend on what glue you're using, but typically what I do is I just peel back an edge and then drip a little bit of glue in there and then let that edge fall back down, pushing it into place. You'll see the glue will actually spread out quite a bit, and you want to kind of hold everything in place while that glue cures, and then you just work your way around both sides. I'll do the rest of this off camera so I don't make a mess, and I'll show you what it looks like. And there we go, guys. Now, I'm very obviously not an expert tire gluer, and this is far from a perfect job, but it came out just fine, and I'm sure it'll hold up to some abuse. And now we're just going to do the exact same thing with the rear tire. To go along with this beautiful black wheel, we've also got an upgraded aluminum hub, a titanium sprocket, and a steel fake rear brake rotor. So far, everything's fitting together perfectly. I am a little bit nervous about the super glue on the wheels and tires. I've never used glue on rubber tires with aluminum wheels before. I did check, and super glue is supposed to be able to glue aluminum to rubber, so it shouldn't be a problem. I guess we'll just have to wait and see once we get this thing out and bash it. And then in the front, we've got this nice fancy upgraded brake rotor. If you're insane enough to be doing a scratch build like me, you'll be happy to know that Trail kits come with basically all the hardware you need, including these very special shoulder bolts, which make this a full floating front disc. Losi made this a floating disc just to prevent problems with misalignment on the brake pads. If this wasn't floating, they would have to design the brake caliper itself so that it put even pressure on the disc. This being able to move around eliminates that problem. And with that, these beautiful wheels are done. It's time to move on to something else. Before we shift gears again and address the rear shock, I did notice that I forgot to install the upgraded mount for the brake servo. This stock mount's pretty flexible, so it's a nice upgrade. And there we go. That's a lot stiffer and should give us better brake feel. Now, speaking of stiffness, I think we're gonna have to upgrade the springs on these shocks because the bike's gonna be a lot heavier than it was stock. I did get these upgraded springs from Hot Racing. Unfortunately, as usual, they're not labeled, so we're just gonna have to figure out which one's the stiffest. Figuring out spring stiffness can be a little bit counterintuitive. Now here we have the stock spring and the 3 Hot Racing springs. First thing we want to check is the wire diameter. This is 2.27 millimeters. This is 2.3 millimeters, as is this and this. So they basically have the same wire diameter. Now here's where it might get a little bit confusing. The spring that has the fewest coils in it is going to be the stiffest spring. That may seem counterintuitive, but let me explain. The fewer the coils, the shorter the actual total length of wire in here is. And if you picture bending a straight piece of wire, the longer that wire is, the easier it'll be to bend. The same thing's true here with these springs. So if we count the coils, and the easiest way to count coils is to start from where the wire actually starts and then count up from there. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 coils on the stock spring. This green spring gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This one's actually gonna be softer than the stock spring. This one gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, which is gonna be about the same as the stock spring. And now the red one gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So this is the only one that's actually stiffer than the stock spring. So we're gonna go ahead and go with the red one. Now I have no idea how thick the shock oil should be, but this is already pretty thick, so I think we're just gonna leave that alone. But we do have some upgraded parts from Trail, so let's make this shock look nicer. We should be able to get away with this without having to completely take the shock apart. Let's go ahead and get that lower eye off first. And then keeping this upside down, we'll just take this bottom cap off, and we can replace it with the metal one. Because there's an O-ring there, we shouldn't need any thread locker here. And we can replace the spring perch. This Trail one does have an O-ring in it. That takes the place of this kind of squeezed down area of the stock collar, which prevents it from moving when you don't want it to. Then we'll put the aluminum lower eye on with a little bit of thread locker, of course. And then we just need to swap out this shock cap. You can see from the bleeder there, this is going to be an emulsion style shock, so it should be pretty easy to bleed again. We obviously don't need to get all of the air out of it because it is that emulsion style. This also has the O-ring on the shock body, so there's nothing to swap out on the cap. And then to bleed it, we just need to remove the bleed screw, compress the shock, and put the screw back in. All right, now we just need to put our stiffer 5-coil spring on, replace that lower spring perch, and she's done and looking good. Hopefully that little bit of extra stiffness on the spring will help accommodate the extra weight of this bike. Now, something I've really been curious about are these front forks. I wonder if they made them the way that regular full-size front forks are, or if they've done something different. Okay, taking this top cap off, we can see we do have an O-ring here, but these springs are completely dry. I don't want to have a bunch of fluid come out here. Okay, so what they've done here is this is the actual shock. The fluid will be inside here. These are the springs. So this basically is just a really long, normal RC shock, and then they put it inside this decorative tube. The reason I took this apart is because I'd like to increase the spring rate of these as well. Unfortunately, even though these springs are marked with colors, they don't tell you what the colors mean. I'm guessing green is the softest and then black is the hardest. I'm not going to subject you to me checking. I'll see you in a second. Okay, so I was right. Green is the softest, black is the hardest. These black springs have slightly thinner wire on them than the silver springs do. That being said, this stock setup doesn't actually have a progressive spring rate because the black spring never compresses all the way. So basically the spring rate is just the combination of these two spring rates. Unfortunately, the hardest black spring in the kit is already on the shock, so that kit's pretty useless to us. The only thing we can do is replace the thinner wire spring with the thicker wire spring, which will increase the spring rate a little bit. These shocks are going to remain mostly stock because there really aren't any upgrades available for them, though we do have a few upgrades to put on them in just a second. And we'll just put this back inside. Like I said, this outside piece is mainly just a decorative tube. It does provide a little bit of extra strength, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the operation of the shock itself. All right, now we just put these nice Treel shock lowers on. And there we go, these are ready to go. I do have the stock protectors, although I'm not sure if I'm gonna put them on or not. I did finally get the battery we're gonna be using. SMC just came out with these new HV HCl batteries. And this 9,000 milliamp hour 2S is the same size as a standard 5,000 milliamp hour 2S. Let's make sure these electronics work before we go any further. Get the transmitter turned on, flywheel off, and power this on. Sounds good so far. Does the brake work? Yep. Throttle. That's working. Let's check the flywheel. Sounds smooth so far. And there we go, she's up to speed and she feels smooth. This also gives me the opportunity to show you what happens with this flywheel. If I try to tip this over, it really resists. As a matter of fact, if I set this down, you'll see it won't even fall over. It just tries to rotate. That's how it helps keep the bike upright. Now, if you've made it this far, first of all, congratulations, because we're just about in the home stretch and this thing's gonna start coming together really quickly now. But second of all, you might as well go ahead and get subscribed because you obviously enjoy this kind of video and we do this sort of thing here all the time. I would just get the swing arm installed, and of course we've got some Treel upgraded steel gears. And we put the sprocket in on this side. No upgraded sprockets available, so I guess this sprocket's pretty good. We don't have to use thread lock on this because this plastic collar acts as a lock nut. The design of this is really good. As you can see, the output sprocket is actually part of the pivot for the rear swing arm. And because of this, as the swing arm goes through its travel, the tension on the chain stays the same. There are a lot of full-size bikes that don't have that feature. I'm definitely excited to see what these all steel gears sound like. I bet this thing is gonna scream. Whenever you're installing a new pinion gear, always make sure you clean the threads with some alcohol and a paper towel. These almost always have some sort of machining oil on them. See that? That will stop the thread locker from working properly. All right, there we go, guys. The gears are all together. I'm a little nervous about the fact that this gear hangs off the pinion shaft so far. Let me know down in the comments if that's normal for the Promoto. I've never actually seen how it's supposed to look. And then, of course, we're gonna top those gears off with this beautiful Treel cover. Oh man, guys, I just realized this beautiful Treel cover also comes with the bottom piece. I'd have to take this entire module back apart again to replace it. I think we're just gonna leave the stock one on there for now. We'll cover it up and no one will know the difference. Let me know down in the comments, would you take it all the way back apart just to replace this little piece, or would you do the same thing I'm doing? And there we go, at least the ugly stock part's hidden. I've got a confession to make. I've been avoiding doing this front suspension for a very good reason. It's pretty complicated. It uses this internal spring design for shock absorption, along with the external shock absorbers, and there's a lot of parts here. I'm not gonna make you sit through all this. I'm gonna zip this all together, then I'll show you how it works. All right, before we finish installing that, we need to put a servo in this front head tube. I'm gonna be using this AGFRC low profile one. I don't think you need to use a low profile servo, but this is a good servo and it's what I have on hand. To go along with that, we're gonna be using the Treel servo saver. It does come with 3 different spring options, the medium one's in here. As with any aluminum servo saver, I would definitely recommend taking this apart and putting some dry lubricant on the sliding surfaces. This is fluid film dry lubricant, but you can use any sort of dry lube such as graphite or Teflon. You just definitely wanna have some sort of lubricant on here, otherwise these surfaces will gall up and it'll jam up the servo saver. And then I would also recommend putting some thread locker on the threads, otherwise the spring might come loose. All right, now we can finish getting this installed. Okay, so that wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it was gonna be, and this is a pretty amazing system. This is like a 4-part linkage between this plate, the spring in here, and the head tube itself, and what it does is gives it just a little bit of give, so in a crash, those fork tubes don't have to take all the impact. A pretty amazing design. All right, guys, this build's gonna start moving quickly. Let's get this bottom skid plate on, put the rear shock and linkage together, and put those on the bike. And then the upper shock mount, which is also the front of the battery tray, goes onto the seat. That all mounts on the shock. And that all mounts down onto the main chassis. There's a little bit of preload on here, so I'm gonna have to do these off camera. Now we just need to install the battery door screws, and the back end of this thing's pretty close to being done. Okay, something is definitely not right with the suspension. There's not nearly enough suspension travel. Let me figure out what I did wrong here. Okay, I just pretty much had the whole thing in upside down. This is a bit of a brain teaser, especially given that the exploded view doesn't really give you much help. Next, we've got the front skid, which we'll just push in there for now because it goes in with screws that hold on the outer plastic piece here. That's pretty tight, so I don't think it's going anywhere. We've got the little fake muffler, and then it's a little premature, but let's get this rear fender on here so that we can actually keep this door closed. All right, guys, home stretch. Last thing we need to do before we put the wheels on is install the steering. You need to install this servo saver first. Before we do that, we need to center the steering. We'll get this thing fired up. This does have a gyro in it, so you have to let it sit for a minute. And we'll make sure our steering trim is centered, which it appears to be. Then we'll get the servo horn installed. And now we just need to put the rest of the steering together, which includes this piece here, and then this screw with a bearing, tiny washer, and a bearing. Try not to use too much thread locker here. I'm gonna wipe some of this off because you really don't want to get that thread locker in the bearings. That's a good amount. And we just make sure those bearings spin freely, which they do. Put our steering bearing on here, and then the lower triple clamp goes into the head tube with those bearings going into the servo saver. All right, guys, so as you can see, the output on this AGF RC servo is significantly lower than the one that comes stock on the bike. Not only that, but it's also further forward, so this just isn't going to work. For now, I'm gonna put the stock one back in because I know this will work. A half hour, a few swear words, and a bunch of disassembly and reassembly later, and we are back in business. The stock servo fits just fine, and the triple clamp is on. The reality is, anytime you're doing a big project like this, there are going to be problems and there are going to be setbacks. I've never had a big build where I didn't have to take things back apart and reassemble them at some point. The most important thing is just to keep in mind it's part of the process, and if you get too frustrated, just walk away for a few minutes, do something else, and then come back to it. There's no point in working on one of these projects when you're upset. It's a hobby and it's supposed to be fun. Now, speaking of fun, it's the moment we've all been waiting for. Let me get this mess cleaned up and let's put these tires on. We do have some oversized bearings to go into these wheels, and we'll get it installed. There we go, and oh man, does that look sexy. All right, and the last mechanical part we need to install is this rear wheel. This is a little bit more complicated because this also includes the chain, and it's spaced out with these spacers, and there's several different ones to choose from, so I'm gonna go ahead and get this figured out, and I'll show you what it looks like. Well, it took some trial and error, but the ones marked 0.5 that way gave me just the right amount of slack in the chain, and it still rolls smooth. And with that, this is a rolling chassis, and this thing's basically mechanically done. Now we just need to do the cosmetics. And of course, the first cosmetic piece I want to install is the handlebars. These don't actually turn with the front wheel. Pretty neat design. Here we go, guys. For the first time, this thing actually looks like a motorcycle. We better make sure it works like a motorcycle before we finish putting it together. To do that, we're just gonna pop a battery in the back, plug that in, fire up the transmitter again, and then turn it on. Yeah, we'll turn on the flywheel again. Thing sounds like a jet taking off. All right, that's definitely working. All right, let's check the throttle. Whoop, little burnout there. Check the brake. That's working. And then finally, let's check the steering. The interesting thing about the steering is it actually goes opposite of what you would think. When I steer to the left, the wheels go to the right. When I steer to the right, the wheels go to the left. This is because of counter steering. All two-wheeled vehicles use counter steering to turn, and this is why. When you're traveling straight forward, you have inertia. When you turn the wheel to the left, the bike is gonna try to go to the left, but you wanna keep going forward. So that actually causes you to lean to the right. It's that leaning that ends up making you turn. So it seems really counterintuitive, but to initiate a right turn, you actually steer left, and to initiate a left turn, you actually steer right. We've got one last mechanical thing to take care of, and that's this brake cable. The Trio front brake is slightly different in design from the stock one, and you actually have to take this arm off to get the cable on. And we'll just slip the cable in here and then put the arm back on again. Make sure you get this spring in its correct position. And it's a good thing we took this off because there's no thread locker on here. You definitely don't want your brakes failing on you. And then the sheath just slips right into this holder. Route this up and over and into the other end. Looking at the cable routing online, I just realized I have this entire brake on the wrong side of the bike. Hang on a second. There we go, I just had to swap the entire fork tube assembly around. No big deal. Let's get the plastics on this thing and see how it actually performs. Let's start with the shock guards, the side covers, the front fender, the rear fender, and then finally the side covers. And there we go, guys. This ultimate Losi Promoto is done. Let's go see if we made the best Promoto ever or just a heavy bike. guys, two things are abundantly clear. First, I need a lot more practice with this thing, and second, this thing is absolutely awesome. I really had a blast with this. As you can see, it handled pretty well. I do think that the rear is oversprung. I might just need to take some preload out of that as it bounced around quite a bit. But overall, for how much more this thing weighs, it actually handled just fine. Speaking of that weight, I wonder how much more this thing weighs than stock. Stock is 7.7 pounds. Let's see how much this one is. Bike's gonna be out of frame, but let's see what we've got. Right at 9 pounds. So that's not too bad. Upgrading absolutely everything on this bike added about 16% extra weight to it, which is definitely more weight, but with a two-wheeled vehicle, more weight can sometimes be a good thing as it can cause increased stability. Of course, I don't have enough experience with the stock one to know whether or not this is more stable, but it felt pretty stable. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. I'm so glad you stayed for the whole thing. You guys are the true fans of this channel. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.